If you hear a fire alarm, it's probably real. The studio team will direct you to the fire exits, but in any event, they are at the other end of the studio, at either side. Again, my left, your right. And there are accessible toilets, including baby change, over there in the corridor next to the kitchen. There'll be a Q&A at the end of this talk. Those of you who are watching online, please pop your questions into the YouTube chat. Joe is here to be your voice in the room today. If you're in the building, please raise your hand and we'll send around a microphone so that the folks at home can hear what you're saying. You can get news on all of our future talks by heading to watershed.co.uk/studio, at Pervasive Media Studio at mastodon.social on Mastodon, at pmstudiouk.bsky.social on Blue Sky, and at Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram. If you're still following us on Twitter/X, we're not posting on there anymore. Haven't been for quite a while now, so please update your feeds, get your information from somewhere else. Our speaker for today. Sorry, I'm standing in Sherry's way. Our speaker for today is Tim Atack. Tim is an award-winning writer and composer, as well as a studio resident. His play Delay, currently running at the Bristol Old Vic, is a queer sci-fi heartbreaker about two lovers exchanging audio messages across galactic distances. And today he's going to talk about how technology is used in fiction, the emotional storytelling made possible by both real and imagined technologies, and how storytellers can make fictional technologies seem not merely convincing, but emotionally true. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Tim.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tim. I'm a white man in my 50s. I have a bald head. I'm wearing glasses. I have an orange beard. And I'm also wearing an Aphex Twin T-shirt, which is very on-brand. So as mentioned, I'm a writer and composer. I work a lot these days in projects where my job merges dramatic writing and digital music. And as mentioned, a play I've written and sound designed is running at Bristol Old Vic at the moment. And among other things, it concerns the deep emotions that come with hearing the voice of someone you love across great distance. In my stories, I very often find myself exploiting the emotional potential of technologies, both real and imagined. And I reckon this might be a good place to share some thoughts and experiences around that. So this isn't going to be the most technical of talks. It's a bit rangy, and it's rooted in feelings rather than data. But I hope it will be entertaining, at least. I'm going to start with a short story. I say short, it'll take about 120 years, give or take. It's a story about how technology can haunt us. It begins with the inventor Thomas Edison, while he's attempting to perfect the phonograph, the basis for what we'd now call a record player or a vinyl deck. Edison is losing his hearing, but he's still confident he can tell good sounds from bad. He does this by biting the device while a recording is playing, sinking his teeth into the wood, the sound rattling his skull. He distinguishes between bad and good vibrations. To begin with, Edison is convinced his phonograph has one distinctive property that marks it out for the ages, and that's not to record and play back music. Edison's hot take is that this machine will allow people to hear the voices of the dead. This machine will, in time, contain a ghost. The sounds it captures will be lost sounds, dead sounds. And in many ways, Edison's not wrong. Especially not in the long run. But like most innovators, he is not entirely in control of what his innovation will mean. In the 1920s, a BBC handbook is one of the first documents we have of two turntables being used in tandem for mixing to ensure continuous playback of classical symphonies, in this case. But the BBC aren't entirely in control of what this will mean. In the late 1930s, the composer John Cage creates Imaginary Landscape No. 1, a piece using 3 turntables as musical instruments. He's not really in control of what this will eventually mean, and he probably enjoys that. It's a key work in the development of what's called musique concrète, a form that utilizes recorded sounds as material for new compositions. God knows how much 21st century music can be described in exactly that way. We'll skip next to 1958, when the playwright Samuel Beckett premieres a short play called Krapp's Last Tape. In it, an old man has collected audio diaries of his life on spool after spool of magnetic tape. And 1958 is only a decade or so after such technology is generally available, and the play's first stage direction describes a late evening in the future. So this play can be read as speculative fiction in imagining a life so recorded. And the old man, Crap, a permanently disappointed author, which is probably why I like the play so much, listens to his younger self and records the final tape of the title. He's arguing with his past throughout. He's berating the man he was. Crap listens to the ghost of himself and will soon become a ghost himself. We'll stay with magnetic tape through to 1971 when another composer, Gavin Bryars, is working on a film about the Elephant and Castle area of South London. He's based at the Fine Art Department of Leicester Polytechnic and uses a recording studio that adjoins a painting studio, busy with students. Bryars has taken a particular loop that he recorded in London of a man living on the streets singing a brief improvised hymn, which he's discovered is both perfectly in tune and it runs to a pleasingly skewed 13 bars. So he leaves this loop running to copy onto a longer tape and he goes and grabs a coffee. When he returns, the normally lively student painting studio is subdued and some people are crying. And Bryars realizes he's left his own studio door ajar and the old man's repeated refrain has been steeping the whole room in this bittersweet melancholy.
Jesus' blood never found me yet, never found me yet. Jesus' blood never found me yet. This one thing I know, for he loved me so.
Gavin Bryars creates a piece of chamber music to this loop, where instruments gradually join in, accumulating, keeping time with the old man, taking his leads, and in many ways, eventually, the music subsumes him. It's called Jesus' Blood Never Failed Me Yet, and I'd call it a concerto for ghost voice and small orchestra. The old man does not live to hear what Bryars has done with his song. It's released on Brian Eno's EG label. Later, the advent of compact disc allows a re-recording with full orchestra uninterrupted by flipping the vinyl. Meanwhile, the turntable has become one of the most important instruments in the history of popular music. The mixing of records, their looping and overlaying, their deconstruction and reconstruction defines a culture that leads, amongst other things, to the art of sampling in pop music. Bringing us to 1986, and here we've got a hip-hop and a skip back and forth. Unless you're an incorrigible nerd like me, you might not know the name Gregory Coleman. Here he is at the top. But if you're able to hear or feel music, it's almost unimaginable that you won't have encountered Gregory's work. In 1969, Coleman is the drummer in a group called the Winstons, and they record a tune called Amen Brother. For almost 20 years, very little happens to this song until in 1986, a drum break from it, played by Coleman, is sampled by Salt and Pepper, and then NWA, and then on literally thousands of other tracks, because this 7-second burst of Gregory Coleman's playing becomes the basis for 2 entire genres of music, jungle and drum and bass. So here he is, this is Gregory in the original recording. And then this is Gregory. 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 And then this is Gregory.
By everyone, that's the winner.
And Gregory Coleman dies, homeless, penniless, in 2006, by all accounts unaware of how far he had travelled, the lives he had touched, the joy he was part of. His musical voice, his drumming, trapped in those 7 seconds, haunts the entire planet. 1 year later, a man called Oswald Lawrence dies. Then we're jumping to 2012, and a GP, Dr. Margaret McCollum, is at Embankment Underground Station in London on her way to work, but she's suddenly heartbroken. She approaches the station staff and, distressed, she asks where the voice has gone, the announcement that says, "Mind the gap." She's told it's been modernised, replaced by digital alternatives for variety. But for over 60 years, the voice at Embankment saying "Mind the gap" has been that of Oswald Lawrence, Margaret's late husband. For some 5 years now, these announcements have meant Margaret has continued to hear Oswald every working day. And sometimes when things have been really tough, she's gone and sat alone in the station just to hear him. Luckily, though, we're in 2012 still, and the screw you spirit of Tory austerity has yet to completely bite. So, London Underground find the original recordings of Oswald, made in 1950, and they restore them. Not only do they present these recordings to Margaret, they reinstate Oswald Lawrence's voice on the platform that she uses. And I hope you're ready for this, because I never am.
Mind the gap. Mind the gap.
A device to hear the voices of the dead? Yes, Thomas Edison. Yes. From 1878 to 2012, please mind the gap between life and death. So important here that I put my hand up and say, of course, we all have different emotional connections to different kinds of technology for as many reasons as there are humans alive. I'm telling you all these interconnected stories because they're among the sad and luminous and haunting things I tend to remember when looking at a 78 RPM shellac record, or when I hear the playback of a dusty old tape on a wonky old reel-to-reel. These are my personal resonances. I carry them through into the stories I write. In any medium, my work tends to feature the bittersweet use of recorded sound with a regularity my collaborators often find comical. In fact, Tanuja Amarasuriya, the director of Delay and a regular director of my plays, she really enjoys pointing out my entire career is just me rewriting crap slaps tape over and over again, like variations on a theme. There's something else about Beckett's play that I just can't let go of, and many people consider it a sideline, but I mentioned it earlier. Crap slash tape is a hair's breadth away from being science fiction. It's set in the future because that collection of audio diaries imagined they could not have been accumulated by 1958. My own personal definition of sci-fi, here we go, is that it's a form where the story is made possible by an imagined technology. So, to my eyes, the film Gravity is speculative fiction rather than sci-fi, whereas the film Interstellar begins as speculative, then gradually, increasingly becomes sci-fi towards the end. Fight me. In writing Crap Slash Tape, Beckett imagined a future state of emotion attached to a relatively new technology. And that's arguably what Edison did, and of course to this day what innovators do with any fresh technology and its uses. I also find it interesting to consider how important, or otherwise, it is for fiction writers to fully detail the technology that enables their stories. So if you consider the mother of sci-fi, Mary Shelley, when she wrote Frankenstein, she was almost entirely concerned with the emotional and dramatic ramifications of a technology, and in that groundbreaking novel, we're barely told the means by which the protagonist brings the dead back to life, only that it has generally unpleasant consequences. But that technology, though pretty much absent, makes the entire story possible. And fast forward to Star Wars, 150 years after Shelley, and the technique is surprisingly similar. When you drill down to the basics, in the original Star Wars film, no one ever really talks about how things work. It's surprising how little discussion there is of the technology. It's just there doing what tech does. And the same is true, of course, of Star Wars' portrait of a multicultural, multilingual, interstellar society. There's a paucity of running explanation that instantly makes it feel much more genuine. Technology in Star Wars is only really discussed if it's a problem or it doesn't work or there's a glitch like an unshielded exhaust port to a main reactor or something like that. The fastest ship in the galaxy is also a total improvised mess, a faulty hot rod. And I'd argue that that's the fiction writer's greatest weapon when trying to make an imagined text seem emotionally true. You break it. Or you make it difficult to use, or it produces the unexpected. Because that's real life. Edison sinks his teeth into the wood. Oswald Lawrence's voice is wiped. Gregory Coleman's drumming is speeded up, cut up, fucked up. Gregory dies forgotten, and that is also fucked up. Another deep influence on my emotional connection to technologies is that I worked for a decade in the BBC archives, which of course involved a running battle with entropy and loss, and not just in the physical archives. I based at least one play and an entire science fiction audio drama called Forest 404 on a moment where I was auditing unlabeled tapes and became spellbound by the recording of a Sumatran rainforest, including that haunting song of an endangered whistling bird. But it's always been the case, for me, that disembodied audio embodies a loss in some way. My origin story here is probably growing up in Brazil, the child of a Yorkshire family, and for 10 years hearing my grandparents mostly as voices on the cassette tapes we would post back and forth across the Atlantic. It was cheaper than a phone call at the time. We would use the same cassette tape over and over again, wiping over each corresponding exchange, and the recording heads on one or both machines must have been imperfectly aligned, because eventually you could hear on this tape, very, very low in the background, this murmuring chorus of past voices, you know, beneath the latest soloist. About 2 decades ago, this cassette disintegrated completely, and with perfect timing, it chose to do so at exactly the moment I attempted to digitize it, which, on distance and disintegrating messages and loss, brings me neatly enough to delay the play I've written running at Bristol Old Vic right now, which is my latest variation on Crap's last tape. It's a queer sci-fi heartbreaker. It's the story of Lynn, an astronaut on a solo mission to make ready the first ever extraterrestrial colony for mankind. Lynn will die alone on this new world. It's part of the plan. His body will be part of the seed material to make the planet habitable. It's a solo mission because of the immense energy requirements to get him there. And the one major concession to Lynn's mental health in all of this is that he's permitted a limited exchange of audio messages with his husband, Silas, back on Earth. But because Lynn is traveling at near light speed, the laws of relativity mean that Silas is aging so much faster than Lynn. 60 days for Lynn will represent Silas's remaining lifetime, if they're lucky. There are several imagined technologies in Delay on what I like to think of as a sliding scale of likelihood. I accept the most sci-fi of these, for any physicist currently frowning at me down the internet, is the ability for an audio signal to keep bouncing back and forth to a near light speed spacecraft in what both recipients consider to be anything remotely like real time. Sure, okay, you got me. This story loves the laws of physics, except when it doesn't. But get this, hear me out. There are communication relay beacons, invented sometime in the mid-21st century, deployed ahead of the mission, and they use quantum entanglement to make these messages possible. Fight me. Tanuja and I call this the sci-fi flim-flam, and we've tried to keep it to a minimum in this show, by which I mean, in this play, Star Wars style, we don't really talk about this particular issue at all. In fact, I didn't mention it, you didn't see me, I wasn't here. The Overton window of what sci-fi audiences will accept really fascinates me. And I've come to believe it's about audiences implicitly wanting a story to be told rather than asking why it should be told. I don't tend to decide in advance what the themes of my plays will be, but Delay eventually emerged as a drama about saying what you mean and saying goodbye. And secretly, under the hood, all the technology in Delay serves that story, propelling us towards its heartbreaking conclusion. Yeah, I just reviewed my own play, shut up, it's fine. So the spacecraft fails, the mission is thrown into jeopardy. Lynn has to decide what's more important, sending his final messages or reaching his destination. Lynn and Silas cannot be sure if their transmissions will connect, and their love is tested to the limit. The cassette disintegrates, flakes away, and the technology fails us all. For me, this takes the sci-fi towards emotional truth, and sure, at the expense of some actual science, but that's been the case since Mary Shelley, right? Our producer on Delay, Amanda Fawcett, noted that emotionally the story proposition was a lot like the feeling of being an individual online, constantly uncertain whether you'd be heard, alone in deep complexity, reaching for connection with every click, but it never quite does the job. In the production of Delay, we're giving the spacecraft, which is called the Oshun, a generally non-digital atmosphere rooted in the concept it's a solo vehicle that in dire straits needs to operate through as much manual control as possible. There's a point in the action where we evoke the feeling of sailing a small boat, the ratcheting of ropes, the resistance of sails. And I think, for me, this is born of a love of those future stories where tech seems worn in, where there's a slight wariness of it, or even a contempt. Thanks to all those times it hasn't worked, it makes it feel dangerous, to my mind. We're increasing that sense of danger in the audio for the show. As the mission encounters greater and greater threats, the sound calls more and more upon electronic interference and zips and screes and hums, some of which I've taken from the theatre itself. Recorded using an electromagnetic microphone, the sound of the theatre lights protesting to give the subliminal impression even the theatre around the audience is going haywire somehow. And here's the sound that a set of LED lights make when they brighten and dim. Going to release that as a single, I think. While working on the recorded voices for Delay, there was one moment that quietly delighted me. I discovered that the best way to make a voice sound as though it had been transmitted over interstellar distance was to put it through software that imitated the effects of an audio cassette. Thanks, grandparents. So, in this production, we're not going down the route of something like Spielberg's Minority Report, which features a glitzy everyday tech that, if it was ever made, would be hazardous by design. It's often been pointed out the most useless sci-fi invention is the transparent digital screen, hovering in midair, utterly unusable in real life. But this returns me to that Overton window I mentioned of what audiences are happy to accept from sci-fi. I love that Minority Report film because it's constantly moving, incessantly paranoid, and the technology is all in service of that. It has this dangerous transparency, literally. It's world building, even if that world makes no sense at all the second you stop to think about it. And a hilarious Overton diagram. There's plenty of research investigating this Overton window in the development of real-world tech, of course. What are we really willing to countenance in how a technology feels? Do we actually want it more fluid, more indistinguishable from the tangible, extremely personal, etc.? Aren't frictions and limitations sometimes very useful? I've often wondered if our general willingness to embrace AI, even with all the attendant dangers, is tempered by our favourite stories that we have about AI, all our anthropomorphic tales about aspirational robotics, or the lovable heroes from Pinocchio to R2-D2 to Buzz Lightyear, who are something other than human, but act like they didn't get the message. My take is that we adore stories about mechanical creatures who aspire to have a soul because we suspect exactly the same description applies to ourselves. So on that tip, I'm going to steer us away from the sad and bittersweet for a moment, more towards the disconcerting and the scary. It will return to hope by the end, I promise. I want to talk about some learning from another writing project of mine, one where I used a certain type of tech to create the story in order to conjure a feeling. It's another play. It's called Some of the People. It's set in the near future, and it has two protagonists. One is a right-wing populist Prime Minister of the UK called A.J. Adams. He's about to make a shock announcement at the United Nations in New York. The other person is an activist journalist called Kai Fernando, who, despite huge industry respect and many awards, simply can't find a willing publisher for her book, which is an unflinching investigation into the life and politics of A.J. Adams. So the play begins with two public events, the aforementioned address to the United Nations, and Kai Fernando doing a Q&A that's hosted by an organisation I'm very much imagining resembles the Bristol Cable, the independent newspaper in this city. From these two launch pads, the action spirals away into other dramatic scenes, formative incidents in both people's lives, then their ideological clashes. The staging jumps from one character to the other like a game of tennis between two players whose lives are running in parallel somehow. And the populist Prime Minister's speech is leading up to a revelation that good ringtone, is leading up to a revelation that I designed to make my own blood run cold, something that I'd both desperately want to happen in the world, but really not in the way depicted, and hopefully one day we'll make that play and all of that can be revealed. So it's a drama really about misinformation and disinformation. It concerns the ethics of modern politics and the role of the media, and so I thought, what if it's always the same story, but in terms of the finer detail, you never see the same play twice? What if I use something like game software to run two auto cues and the performers are given choices, not too many, but just enough so the narrative branches away at crucial points, and each night an audience might walk away having seen a show that was different to any other. It wouldn't be a trick played on the audience, that's crucial. The facts of the story, whether revealed or not, would always be the same. It's just the information each night might speak of different things. It might lead to subtly or markedly different conclusions about what was being said up on stage. Now, it seemed to me this would feel like information in the modern world. We receive it through filters of choice, through the power of a very small number of actors. So I was lucky enough to get an attachment at National Theatre Studio to develop this idea. Over a year or so, I occasionally shut myself away in one of their writers' rooms and covered the walls in flowcharts, investigating the best route through this unwieldy concept. And the key discovery for me was that if I was going to present something where the core dramatic information might change from one performance to the next, I needed a different kind of anchor for all of these versions to stop it becoming just this free-for-all of ideas. And so I chose emotions to define the story development rather than any other kind of story engine. You can see the emotions sort of marked out across the top of what I like to call my murder wall here. The scenes might change, but the overall feeling or vibe or whatever you want to call it would always follow the same pattern from show to show, like the movements of a symphony. I came to think of these as emotional guiding principles, and these are some of them in post-it note form. I wrote a whole bunch of the show in a software called Twine. It seemed to work. I decided on headlines, summaries for what all those different branching modules might be, the varying takes they would offer an audience. Then I figured out that if I wanted a proof of concept, I best choose a random route through all of these options and then write that out in full. By the end of my residency, that was what I produced, a script of one route through the entire show. It was read by the dramaturg at National Theatre Studio at the time, Stuart Pringle, and by my agent Emily, and by Tanuja, and all of them said exactly the same thing. This is a great play, you don't need the alternative versions. But I said, but my map, please look, my branches. And they all said, yeah, but now basically, Tim, you've written the play. You've written it now, it does all those jobs already without any of the fancy dancing. I think it was Stuart Pringle who said, I suspect if you add any more to it, you're kind of putting a hat on a hat. And I thought, damn it, they're right. The innovation in my own practice here came not with the technology on stage. Instead, the idea of that tech generated a very distinctive form of story. Imagining those slippery branches gave all of my writing in this a slippery feel, very, very different to anything I might have written otherwise. And the crucial outcome was that I wrote a political play that dealt not in the facts you knew, but in everything you didn't, anchored to a progression of emotions rather than an intellectual story engine, as a lot of political plays are. So I used what I understood of the tech to achieve a feeling, and then I dropped the tech. And then maybe that's why in my next play I'm going to put the technology in the show literally on stage, so there's no getting away from it. Next up, I want to write a love letter to digital music making and sampling, something on the complications of modern commercial pop and its origins in the music of the oppressed, something about cultural appropriation and assimilation. It's going to be called Good Number, and here we're back to Gregory Coleman and the Arm & Break and the Ghost Voice. It'll be set in both the late 40s and the modern day. In 1948, a veteran bluesman and a song collector are touring the prisons of the American Deep South, trying to uncover deep cuts in folk and blues music. In one prison, they discover that the only suitably soundproof room to make their recordings in is the room that houses the electric chair. The sessions they capture there become legendary, full of argument and abandoned takes. And those tapes eventually influenced the forming of a 21st century hip-hop band called Good Number. Good Number have experienced wild success very early in their career, and it almost splits them up. So, attempting to revisit the source of their inspiration, they travel to that same execution chamber to make their next album. Only when they get there does the self-appointed leader of Good Number reveal that he's gained physical access to the 1940s recordings. He has the spools with him, and he wants to use them as raw material for the album. So the two sessions in 1940 and the 21st century play out simultaneously on stage. There are connections between events that are only visible to the audience, and both sessions begin to speak of a make or break moment for all concerned, some last chances in art, in life, and of course there are ghost voices, voices hidden deep on unexpected parts of the 1940s tape, hauntings. Yet of course the technologies present in this story aren't all creative. One is very definitively the opposite. Worth noting that the electric chair as a method of execution was first imagined by Alfred P. Southwick, a dentist. Like most innovators, Southwick was not really in control of what his innovation would come to mean. And by the by, Thomas Edison was also a consultant in its initial construction. For me, the chair is a totem of human failure, one that represents not just the deaths of its victims, but the death of imagination, empathy, forgiveness, and hope. Recording music in the room that housed this terrifying object is actually something that happened. The song collector John Lomax and the legendary bluesman Lead Belly did exactly that in Little Rock Prison in Arkansas while on a tour. And as soon as I read about this incident, it immediately it gave me a driving emotion for the drama based on the conflict between these technologies. On the one hand, the chair, a device that does not do a single thing it's purportedly designed to do. Kill humanely, bring justice, maintain the peace, deter crime. An utter failure of human invention on every single level. And surrounding it, musicians and recordists with their instruments representing the messy, living abstractions and freedoms of art. And my catch-all definition of art is that it's a tool that human beings can use to shape the experience of being alive. So wrapping us up and back to the present, if you'd like to see Delay, here's the plug. It's on at Bristol Old Vic until July the 5th. If you're interested in the kinds of thinking and creative processes that led us to make a show like this one, then there are a couple of workshops we're running here at Watershed next week. One with Tanuja focused on directing and one with me on writing. There's some links on the slide that I'll leave up at the end. This is like that bit in Hot Fuzz, isn't it, where he steps in front of the picture of himself. Not comparing myself to Timothy Dalton. Today I'm going to fade us out with a final ghost voice, a short 1948 recording by Leadbelly. These sessions were an attempt to capture Leadbelly's work in better quality on a brand new format on magnetic tape. So he was very used to the procedure by now. He's audibly comfortable at the microphone. And the song is called Nobody in This World is Better Than Us, and I'll say up front, it contains some outdated contemporary terms for black people. Leadbelly himself sounds keen to record this one. There's pride and pain and anger and love in the lyrics, a vast range of emotions, yet a remarkable ease in the delivery, the sense that the words might ring through the ages, and to my ears, that leads to a sense of hope for all concerned. So I'll end with this one.
Is that still going?
Sure.
Well, look, yeah, I'll do this one in there.
Right.
You want to hear?
You may.
Now listen what I'm outlining to you. Negroes fought in World War I and II. Some lose their lives, others lose their hands. Still is fighting for the United Nations. If the Negroes was good enough to fight, why can't we get a little equal rights? For God made us all and in Him we trust. Nobody in this world is better than us. Why don't you folks realize with one another, like the scripture said, love thy neighbor? If you are Jewish or Italian, Negroes, separate of Great Britain, it's one thing folks should all realize, 6 feet of dirt makes us all of one size. But God made us all and in Him we trust. Nobody in this world is better than us. I've been hearing you speaking about that old democracy, that diplomatic, that old hypocrisy. I think it's about time you should cut it out, the way the Negroes is treated down south. And my old opinion is a rotten shame. I like to want to bring back slavery again. But God made us all and in Him we trust. Nobody in this world is better than us. Nobody in this world is better than us. Nobody in this world is better than us.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tim. Does anyone have any questions for Tim? Yes, I'll just get you a microphone. Yep.
More of a comment than a question.
For sure.
Is that working?
Apparently not. Turned on at the bottom. It's not turned on. There you go.
Is that working?
That's working. Go for it.
More of a comment than a question, but I was interested in where you were talking about a story world, and I think of it as mise en scène, so not a lot of exposition, but just launching the audience into a situation which
Just go on, we'll get it.
they can understand emotionally.
Yeah.
And it makes a lot of sense when I watch some science fiction that has so much exposition.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate that thought that when J.R.R. Tolkien talked about Lord of the Rings, he said Gandalf can only be in one place at a time.
Yeah.
This could happen elsewhere. So it's like we understand. It's a bit of work for the audience to understand the rules.
And how you set up those conditions is also a part. It's also such an important part of the exposition. But you don't want to lay everyone down with rules right from the start. Like explaining that about Gandalf right from the beginning is probably going to bore me even more than it already does. but yeah, and also there's also that amazing thing in the decisions that you make as a writer about kind of like how you're going to exploit all those imagined things. I was thinking the other day, for instance, about how little breaking down of technology there is in something like Dune, for instance, in both Frank Herbert's book Dune and the recent films, where there's only, to my mind, one instance where like sort of there's something that fails in any way. I realise that technology in Dune is kind of like imagined as non-computer and therefore sort of like based on a different set of rules to the ones that we have. But it's interesting how those things kind of like contribute to the overall emotional air of those stories, of what you're looking out for, what you're worried about.
Any other questions? Yes.
Hello.
Yeah, it's working.
I just wanted to maybe just sort of get your thoughts around, when you speak, you have such a sensitivity to technology and its sort of emotional resonance, particularly around sound. And I wondered around making theatre.
Yeah.
And how sometimes the sort of clunky edges of like what theatre can do in terms of representation, like where you meet that and it's an opportunity, and where you meet that and it sort of makes you want to scream and shout and just wish you'd written a short story.
Yeah.
You know, like how do you navigate that? Like the sort of the opportunity and the the Stuart Pringles that say it needs to look like this one thing.
Yeah, and it's perhaps worth saying that in the production of Delay that we've got on at the moment, there is what we've described as a props graveyard. There are loads of things that are kind of like written in some way into the text that were bit by bit cut because they just didn't feel like they were part of that particular production. I think there's that funny thing about writing something that you imagine as a playwright might be put onto many stages. You hope as a playwright that maybe one day it will be put on many stages. But then you learn making one particular kind of production in one particular kind of place. There's certain things that you're just not going to either need or want. So there were quite a few bits and pieces of like, I don't know, I suppose I wrote quite a few interfaces into Delay, you know, things that the lead performer might interact with. And we got rid of those quite fast and transferred them into dialogue instead. It just felt like it was more part of that world in that moment. And I suppose that's the thing that happens with theatre, isn't it? Your greatest weapon in theatre is the present. That's the most powerful thing you have. So you've got to be very careful, just as in any other form, not to drag people out of it. And I think what we found in this particular production was a prop of some kind would probably do that. Just didn't feel like it was part of what we were making.
Anybody else? Oh, we've got one online.
This isn't from someone online, this is from me. But firstly, I wanted to check, Tim, how do you feel about gentle spoilers around Delay? Yes, so I saw the play last night. It's wonderful. I recommend everyone goes and sees it. Listening to you talk made me think about the final message, voice note that's sent in the piece, and that last message, he actually uses someone else's words to send that message in a way that sort of hasn't been true. In a way, it's a kind of sample. And so I'm sort of interested in that choice in relation to what you've been saying about voice over time and across people, and wanted to hear a little bit about that, if you don't mind sharing.
I think one of the most, for me, I've been writing lots of stories recently that have ended up ruminating upon what it is to be part of a larger story. And that, I think, is one of the most kind of like, I don't know, complex, and I'm going to use complex in an advised way rather than talking about complicated emotion. It's a complex emotion because you don't know where you're going to fit in the grand scheme of things. That's the one thing that none of us will have. And it seems to me like one of the amazing things about being able to hear these voices from many years ago is that it really kind of like accentuates how much we're part of a longer story that none of us will ever truly understand. And so that, I think, is what I was heading towards in kind of like in Delay in the end. And I head towards that in lots of other stories as well. But I think that's kind of like what arrests me when I hear a voice from, 1878 or whenever it might be. The feeling that I have of kind of like this is part of a kind of like a chain, almost like a chain letter of emotions that are being passed on.
Thank you.
Anybody else got a question? Yep.
Hello. Basically wanted to get your thoughts on the idea that this loss that we might feel when a piece of recorded media is destroyed or disintegrates is kind of an invented problem because we never had these technologies before.
Yeah.
17th, 18th century, and sort of follow-up question to that is, do you think there's a difference between an important moment not captured and that moment captured but then lost?
I'm going to go to the last one first because I've actually made decisions in the past myself not to capture a moment. Some really remarkable things that I've seen, and kind of like it felt really powerful. Not to like sort of look upon something and sort of think, I've got to remember this. I absolutely have to remember this. What I think about is the scant records we have about the invention of writing, and the fact that there's records of people in sort of like ancient Egypt saying that writing is undoubtedly going to be a bad thing because men will forget. They will not use their memory, they will forget. I also love the fact that some of the earliest records that we have of writing are complaints. Complaints about, like not being given the right number of sheep or whatever. But the first part of the question as to it being an invented problem, yeah, I guess we're inventing our problems all the time, aren't we? we're inventing even more for ourselves all the time. But I don't know. I think it's it's a remarkable thing to have this sort of like condition where we're able to capture and lose stuff. And I sort of feel I've written in the past about Forest 404, the audio series that I wrote, involved people of future generations sifting through the digital archaeology that our generation had left behind, and looking through countless images of sunsets, and looking through, and in the case of Forest 404, imagining a post-natural world where nothing of nature was left whatsoever, and these entities were sifting through what was left of kind of like images of trees and like sort of the sounds of the natural world. So I've only ever considered it to be kind of like, in terms of invented problems, I've always loved it. Yeah, I think they consider it more of a nuisance as well. They consider it more of something that they ought to recycle that material. They ought to, like work out what's useful keeping and what's like absolutely is of no value whatsoever. So the first thing that happens in Forest 404 is someone wipes the recording of the moon landing because they consider it to be a random like sort of radio communication. Which is funny because, of course, the BBC did just that in the they wiped their own copy of the moon landing almost immediately after it was broadcast.
This question's from Duncan. He says, do you have any thoughts on whether work related to technology should be considering what forms of labour or exploitation might have been involved in its creation?
I think about this an awful lot with AI. Yeah, I think about the fact that AI is kind of there's a lie to it, that it's not going to that it's quick and easy, and that it's making things quicker and easier when really it's built upon the kind of like endless unpaid hours of work from Chinese students, or from every time an image is generated, it's the energy that it takes to boil a kettle, whatever it might be. All these things being the hidden costs in the background. And I've often thought about what kind of stories there are to be written around that. It sounds to me like that is an entire story in and of itself. That it would be something that would kind of like be, it sounds to me like an angry story as well. So thanks, Duncan. I'll start working on that straight away.
Any more questions from the audience? If not, I've got one actually, Tim.
Oh, great.
So you talked about making work around both real and imaginary technologies.
Yeah.
I was wondering, what's the difference for you between working with something that's real and exists in the world and something that you get to come up with your own rules for?
I write a lot of Doctor Who audio drama, which means that I have to that involves inventing technologies constantly. And I think there is that, it always makes me think of the well-known Arthur C. Clarke quote about a sufficiently advanced, I'm going to get it wrong, paraphrased, a sufficiently advanced technology being, to certain observers, being not distinguishable from magic. So, and it kind of like, it's interesting that in recent months, actually, Doctor Who has headed very much into magic territory and has kind of like slid into that Clarke paradigm rather than constantly like sort of foregrounding the realism of those technologies. I enjoy both kinds. I enjoy writing about technologies that are on the verge of magic. It all depends on the story, I think, is the answer in the end. It all depends upon whether you really want to focus on it or whether it's just something that is going to catalyze some essential part of your story and you just want it to be there. The sonic screwdriver in Doctor Who is a great example. It's pretty much a magic wand. And over the years, it's constantly changed kind of like its function from literally being a screwdriver back in the 1960s to now being basically something that will just move your story along in whatever way you want. Get you through whatever door you need to get through.
We've got one more.
A question from Arinma. Have any of the technologies that you've imagined come into real life or been created?
I'm not Arthur C. Clarke, no, that's never happened to me.
Not yet.
I mean, not yet. I guess every now and then you do, as a writer, you do have that moment where you think, have I stumbled across something? Have I just inadvertently, just because I desperately needed to fulfill this story function, have I invented something that's actually going to be useful? And I don't know, I'll get back to you about that one. Check in 20 years' time if I'm still around.
Any last questions from the audience? Oh, yeah, go on.
Sorry, one more.
No.
Who do you go to for inspiration? Like, who are the writers that you're like, I need to return to you in terms of science fiction and
on this particular theme?
Fiction.
On this particular theme, I grew up reading a lot of J.G. Ballard, and Ballard was always great with the perturbing subconscious functions of technology. He described, I'll also get this quote wrong, but I think he described the telephone as the shrine to the desire that the world will talk to you. And so it's his descriptions of tech on that sort of level that have always been deeply affecting to me and have inspired me to kind of like think about the technologies that I use that way as well. So there's Ballard and there's Le Guin as well, who kind of like feels like Le Guin's use of technology is fantastic because it's almost constantly background. It's almost always in that fantastical space. And I love that. It kind of like feels like it's very similar to the Star Wars method of not really talking about it. It's kind of like cultural. She'll use it culturally, I think, as much as anything.
Anything else before we finish? Oh, Tim.
It's just a really quick one about what technology that you've written would you like to see invented in 20 years? Obviously, there's been a lot of talk about how innovation, you're not aware of the consequences of it, so I know this is a bit of a loaded question, but if you had to give an answer.
It's a funny one, that, because almost all the time as a dramatist, you're imagining things that are bad.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like if you come up with something that's actually good. I suppose there's the one that I mentioned about the kind of like the quantum entanglement, message sort of like delivery system. That feels to me like if we were ever to like go anywhere close to like sort of traveling the stars, it would be a way of making sure that people could still keep in touch with the ones who've been left behind. So I kind of like feel like if there's anything, it's the one in Delay, because it enables that connection, and it might just make leaving the Earth, if we have to, or if we have to find other places, it might make that a little bit more bearable for those that have to do it.
We have one last one from Tim.
Do you think story authorship is itself a technology, or could be viewed as such? That not a mysterious process by one person in a room with a blank sheet of paper, but something that's a kind of cultural artifact that has all the different ways of sustaining it and propagating it and distorting it?
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? When I first joined the studio here, and the first project that I worked on, it was kind of like it was looking at a really kind of like ancient technology. It wasn't looking at something cutting edge at all. We were looking at, I was working with an instrument maker called Sam Underwood, and we were looking at kind of bellows mechanisms and getting something to run using that. And and it's always tempting to forget that books are a technology as well, all that kind of thing. So in terms of is it a technology to have a thought process?
And with that, we'll say thank you to Tim.
Thanks, Tim.
All right, and that is probably all we got time for today, so please do join me in saying thank you to Tim. All right, before you all go, if you want to stick around in Hot Desk today or find out more about what we do, then please come find one of the studio team. Studio team, give us a wave. There's other people around. If you're watching online, drop us a line on studio@watershed.co.uk with any questions. If you're here in the building today and you would like to see some of the work that our work experience students have been getting up to, then please hang around. They'll be showing off some stuff at 2:30. They've been working on some robotics projects, so there's some exciting early stage robotics experiences to see at 2:30 here in the studio. If that doesn't float your boat, that's fine. Thank you all for being here today, and we'll see you all again next time.